There are places on Earth where making one wrong decision can cost you hours. And then there are places where one wrong decision can remove you from the map completely. The Sahara is one of those places. No trees, no roads, no buildings. Sometimes no landmarks at all. Just sand, heat, sky, and distances that are almost impossible to understand until you're standing inside them. I've always found deserts strangely beautiful, but I also think they may be one of the most psychologically terrifying places to get lost. In a forest, at least you have something around you. Trees, rocks, streams, shade. In the desert, you can stand on top of a dune, look in every direction, and see absolutely nothing that tells you where to go. And in 1994, an Italian athlete named Mauro Prosperi discovered exactly how terrifying that could become. He entered the Sahara to run a race. 9.5 days later, he emerged from the desert weighing only around 43 kilograms. He had almost no water, almost no food. Search aircraft had failed to find him, and at one point he had become convinced that he would never leave the desert alive. What happened between those two moments is one of the strangest survival stories I've ever read. And honestly, there were several points where I had to stop and ask myself, how is this man still moving? Mauro Prosperi wasn't an inexperienced tourist. That's important. He was extremely fit. He had spent years competing as a modern pentathlete. He had represented Italy at the 1984 Olympic Games in Los Angeles. He was also a police officer. So physically, this wasn't someone who walked into the desert completely unprepared. He understood endurance. He understood pain. He understood what his body could do. And maybe that confidence was part of the problem. Because in 1994, Prosperi entered the Marathon des Sables. If you've never heard of it, imagine someone looking at a normal marathon and saying, not difficult enough, then moving it into the Sahara, then making it hundreds of kilometers long. Competitors carry much of their own equipment while crossing dunes, rocky terrain, and extreme heat. And I have to tell you, I enjoy exercise. I understand why people push themselves. There's something satisfying about discovering that your body can do something you thought it couldn't. But there is a point where I look at an event like this and think, you know what? Maybe a normal Sunday run is enough. Prosperi clearly disagreed. He wanted the challenge. And at first, he was doing extremely well. The race moved through Morocco. Temperatures were brutal. The ground constantly changed. Some sections were flat, others were covered in dunes. Every runner had to manage energy, navigation, and water. But the race organizers had checkpoints. That was the key. You didn't need to carry enough water to cross the entire Sahara. You carried enough to reach the next checkpoint. Then you refilled. That system works perfectly. Until you don't reach the next checkpoint. And that is exactly what happened to Mauro Prosperi. During one stage of the race, he noticed the wind beginning to change. At first, the sand started moving. Small dunes seemed almost alive. Prosperi later described the movement as almost mesmerizing. And then, the horizon disappeared. A wall of yellow sand came toward him. A sandstorm. Now, the organizers had warned the runners about this. If a sandstorm arrived, they were supposed to stop. Find shelter. Wait. Don't try to navigate when you can't see anything. Very sensible advice. There was just one small problem. Where exactly do you hide in the middle of a desert? There isn't exactly a Starbucks every 3 miles. No building, no tunnel, no convenient rock shelter. Prosperi tried to protect himself, but the sand kept covering him. So he moved. Stopped. Got covered. Moved again. And that storm continued for around 7 hours. 7 hours. Try to imagine that. Wind screaming around you, sand hitting your skin. You can barely see. Every landmark disappears. And the entire time, the ground itself is changing. Because dunes move. That's what makes this so much worse. When the storm finally stopped, Prosperi looked around. And the desert he had entered was gone. Not literally, but every visual reference he had been using had disappeared. The landscape had been rewritten. He looked at his compass, looked at the dunes, and did what an elite athlete is trained to do. He kept moving. And this is where, in my opinion, the race mindset almost killed him. Think about it. For years, Prosperi's brain had been trained around one idea: move forward. You're tired? Move. You're losing? Move faster. You're uncomfortable? Ignore it. You finish the race. That mentality can make you an incredible athlete. But the desert doesn't care whether you finish. And Prosperi was still thinking like a competitor. He believed he had simply lost some time, so he began running. He wanted to catch the others, maybe still finish strongly, maybe even stay competitive. And I genuinely love this detail because it's so human. The man is beginning to disappear into the Sahara, and part of his brain is still thinking about the leaderboard. Then hours passed. No competitors, no checkpoint, no markers, nothing. He climbed a dune and looked around. Nobody. That's when the situation finally changed in his mind. He wasn't behind, he wasn't off pace, he was lost. That first night, Prosperi still wasn't convinced he was in serious trouble. And I understand why. The race organizers knew he was out there. There were vehicles, helicopters, people searching the route. Surely someone would find him. So he prepared for the night. And weirdly enough, he found the desert beautiful. The temperature dropped, the sky filled with stars. No city lights, no buildings, nothing between him and the universe. And there's something almost cruel about that image. One of the most beautiful skies you could ever see, while you're slowly becoming a missing person. Prosperi remembered something his grandfather had told him about soldiers during wartime when water ran out. So while he was still relatively hydrated, he saved some of his urine in a bottle as an absolute emergency reserve. He didn't believe he'd actually need it. Why would he? Tomorrow someone would arrive. Tomorrow he'd be rescued. Tomorrow he'd laugh about the whole thing. Except tomorrow came. And nobody arrived. The next morning, Prosperi continued moving. Then he heard something. A helicopter. And if you're making this video, this is one of those moments where I would almost cut the music completely. Because imagine the emotion. You're lost, you're thirsty, you've spent the night alone. Then suddenly, rotor blades. That sound means everything. People, water, safety, home. Prosperi saw the helicopter flying low, so low that he could make out the pilot. He fired his emergency flare. He waved an Italian flag from his backpack. He shouted. He ran after it. And the helicopter kept going. It didn't see him. I don't know what that does to a person's mind, because before that moment, you can tell yourself, they're looking for me. Afterward, you know they were looking. You know they were close, and it still wasn't enough. The sound of the helicopter disappeared, and Prosperi was alone again. That might be one of the most psychologically brutal moments in this entire story. Not seeing rescue. Almost being rescued. There's a difference. By now, the water situation was becoming serious. Prosperi had dehydrated food in his backpack. That's almost useless if you don't have water. Food becomes secondary surprisingly quickly. Your body can go a long time without eating. Without water, different story. Especially while moving through extreme desert heat. Prosperi began changing his behavior. He moved during the cooler parts of the day, early morning, late afternoon. When the heat became unbearable, he tried to rest. And this is something I think is worth appreciating. He had to stop being an athlete. He had to stop treating the desert like a race. Winning now meant using less energy, moving slower, sweating less, watching the environment, everything his competitive instincts hated doing. On his second day lost, Prosperi climbed a tree, and from there, he saw something, a structure. At that point, I can imagine the thought: people, water, shelter, maybe a house, maybe someone lives there. He moved toward it. What he found was an old marabou, a small Islamic burial shrine. No village, no family, no rescue, just an abandoned structure in the desert. But at least it had walls, shade, a roof. And for a man being cooked alive by the Sahara, that was enormous. He entered, and then he heard squeaking. Bats. Small bats were living inside the shrine. And this is where the story becomes something I don't think most of us can really relate to. Because hunger changes what counts as food. Prosperi caught some of the bats. He ate them raw. Not because he had developed some sudden interest in desert cuisine, because he understood that their bodies contained both nutrients and moisture. I won't pretend I'd handle that well. I probably wouldn't. But sitting here with water beside me and food available makes my opinion completely irrelevant. When starvation and dehydration start making the decisions, the rules change. Prosperi stayed around the shrine, and again, rescue came close. He heard an aircraft. This time, he needed something bigger than a flare. So he tried to create smoke. He used equipment from his backpack, anything that might produce a visible signal. A dark plume against the desert. And just as he tried, another sandstorm arrived. I mean, come on. At a certain point, this story feels personal. Like the Sahara itself had decided, no, you're staying. The storm destroyed the opportunity. Prosperi waited inside the shrine for hours while sand hammered the structure. And when it ended, there was no aircraft, no rescue, nothing. Again. At this point, his psychological state changed dramatically. He began thinking about his family, his wife, his children. He was a police officer. And he worried about what would happen if he disappeared completely and nobody ever found his body. The desert could erase evidence quickly. Sand, wind, distance. If he simply walked until he collapsed somewhere, would anyone ever find him? During one of his darkest moments, Prosperi became convinced that he would not survive and made an attempt to end his life inside the shrine, believing that at least his body might then be recovered and his family would know what happened. It did not work, and when he woke again, he interpreted that survival very simply. He wasn't supposed to die there. Now, whether you see that spiritually or psychologically doesn't really matter to me. What matters is what happened next. Something in him changed. Before, he had been waiting for rescue. Now, he was going to rescue himself. This is where I think the real survival story begins. Because now, Prosperi accepted something terrifying. Nobody might find him. So he had to move. He remembered the race briefing. If lost, move toward the clouds that gather near the horizon. Clouds can indicate areas where moisture or different terrain might exist. So that's what he did. He left the only real shelter he had and started walking. Honestly, that's an unbelievable decision. Stay inside a structure where rescuers might eventually see you, or leave and walk into an enormous desert where your body may disappear forever. There isn't an obviously good answer. He chose movement. And from that point onward, every calorie mattered. Every drop mattered. Every patch of shade mattered. The desert was now his entire world. During the day, the heat could become crushing. The ground radiated heat upward. The sun attacked from above. There was almost nowhere to hide. He began using every piece of shade he could find. Trees weren't scenery anymore. They were survival equipment. A few branches could mean the difference between resting in survivable heat and continuing until your body failed. Prosperi began looking for anything alive, and I mean anything. Plants, insects, small animals. He ate what he could find. Leaves, large ants, other small creatures. He found mice and snakes around vegetation. Again, not pleasant. Not glamorous. But that's what I like about real survival stories. They're rarely glamorous. Survival isn't a steak cooked beside a campfire while inspirational music plays. Sometimes survival is staring at an insect and thinking, protein. And then came the thirst. Real thirst. Not, I forgot my water bottle at the gym. Desert dehydration. Your mouth dries. Your saliva disappears. Your lips split. Your tongue becomes uncomfortable. Your body tries to reduce water loss. Your urine becomes darker and more concentrated. Eventually, thinking itself becomes harder. And Prosperi still had to navigate. That's what terrifies me, because navigation requires judgment, and dehydration slowly takes judgment away from you. You have to make decisions with a brain that is becoming less capable of making decisions. Which direction? How far? Do I rest? Do I continue? Is that actually vegetation? Is that a shadow? Is that water? Or am I seeing what I want to see? Mirages are one of those desert things that sound almost funny when you see them in cartoons. Person sees beautiful lake, runs toward it. Lake disappears. Funny. Until you're dying of thirst. Then imagine seeing something that looks like water. Your entire body wants it to be real. You walk, and it doesn't get closer. Eventually you realize nothing is there. That must destroy something inside you each time, because the desert doesn't only take water, it can take your ability to trust your own eyes. Prosperi continued walking toward the cloud formations. He cut the backs of his running shoes because his feet had become badly damaged. Again, think about how different he looked from the athlete who started the race. At the beginning, Olympian, strong, fast, competitive, running across dunes. Now, weight falling away, lips cracked, skin burned, feet destroyed, clothes filthy, walking slowly from one patch of shade to another. The race was gone. The medals were gone. There was one objective: don't stop. And weirdly, Prosperi later said he didn't experience the desert purely as an enemy. That's something I find fascinating, because you'd expect him to hate it. Instead, he became intensely aware of everything around him. Animals, plants, shapes in the terrain, clouds, wind. The smallest detail mattered. For most of us, if we see a tree, it's a tree. For Prosperi, shade. Maybe insects, maybe an animal nearby, maybe edible vegetation, maybe moisture. When survival strips away everything else, attention becomes incredibly sharp. The world gets smaller, but every part of that smaller world becomes important. Days passed. 3, 4, 5, 6. At some point, I think numbers almost stop meaning anything. You're not living according to a calendar anymore. You wake when there is light. You move when the temperature allows. You hide when the sun becomes too strong. You search for anything that keeps your body functioning. Then darkness. Then cold. And yes, the desert becomes cold at night. That's another cruelty. During the day, your body is begging for shade. At night, temperatures can collapse, and now you're trying to stay warm. Heat, cold, heat, cold, and every cycle leaves you weaker. Meanwhile, people were searching for him. Race organizers, vehicles, helicopters, Moroccan authorities, trackers. They knew Mauro Prosperi was missing. But here's the problem. The sandstorm had destroyed his route. The search teams were looking based on where they thought he should be. Prosperi was no longer where anyone expected. This happens again and again in survival stories. The person who is lost thinks, "Why can't they find me?" The rescuers think, "Where could he possibly have gone?" And between those two questions, there can be hundreds of kilometers. Prosperi was drifting farther away from the expected race route. Eventually, he crossed into Algeria. He had unknowingly moved through a border region that included landmine danger. And when I learned that, my reaction was basically, of course. Because apparently being lost, dehydrated and starving in the Sahara wasn't enough. Now we add landmines. His body was deteriorating, but he kept moving. And this is where elite sport probably did save him. Not because he could still run, he couldn't. But years of training had taught him how to suffer without immediately stopping. There's a difference between strength and tolerance. Strong people can move heavy things. Endurance athletes develop this strange relationship with discomfort. Pain doesn't immediately mean stop. Fatigue doesn't automatically mean impossible. And in Prosperi's case, that mentality became useful again. But now it was tempered by something he'd learned the hard way. Pay attention. Don't just push. Adapt. One day, he saw movement. Tiny shapes in the distance. At first, he thought they might be dromedaries. He moved closer. They weren't camels. They were goats. And goats mean something very important. People. Goats in the middle of nowhere are usually not managing their own agricultural operation. Someone is nearby. Prosperi kept walking. Then he saw a young girl herding them. Imagine that moment. 9.5 days. Sand, sun, thirst. No human voices. Aircraft passing without seeing you, believing you're going to die. And then, a person. Not a mirage, not a shadow, a real human being. Prosperi understood immediately. He had made it. Or at least, he had reached people. The girl led him toward a Berber settlement. The families there gave him goat's milk, and his body rejected it. That's how far gone he was. The thing he'd spent days dreaming about, food, liquid, nourishment, arrived, and his body couldn't simply handle it normally anymore. Prosperi had become severely dehydrated and malnourished. By the time he was found, he reportedly weighed around 43 kilograms. An elite athlete reduced to 43 kilograms. Just sit with that number for a second. That's what 9.5 days in the Sahara had done. And even rescue wasn't immediately simple. Prosperi had crossed into Algeria. Authorities initially didn't know who this strange, skeletal Italian man wandering out of the desert actually was. He was reportedly taken by military police, initially treated with suspicion, until his race documents helped confirm the unbelievable story. Eventually, he was hospitalized, intensive care, rehydration, recovery, and then finally Home. Back to Italy. Back to his family. Back to a world where you turn a tap and water comes out. I wonder what that first normal glass of water felt like. We drink water without thinking. You open a bottle, take 3 sips, leave half of it somewhere. To someone who nearly died because he didn't have it, that probably looks insane. But here's my favorite part. You might assume Mauro Prosperi learned a very obvious lesson. Never do the Marathon des Sables again. Perfectly reasonable. You were lost for 9.5 days, you nearly died, you ate bats. Search teams couldn't find you. You accidentally crossed an international border. Surely we're done with desert ultramarathons. No. Prosperi recovered, trained again, and returned to the Marathon des Sables. Multiple times. When asked about returning to competition, his attitude was essentially, "I finish my races." And I'm sorry, that's completely insane. I respect it, but it's insane. If the Sahara did that to me, the closest I'd ever get again would be watching a documentary from an air-conditioned room. Prosperi went back. But I also understand something about it. Because Prosperi didn't come away believing the desert had defeated him, he came away feeling that it had taught him something. Before getting lost, he was an athlete focused on the finish line. Win, move, don't look around. Afterward, he talked about noticing life, trees, animals, the environment. The desert forced him to stop treating the world like background scenery. Everything became information, everything became valuable, and there's something about that I genuinely like. I don't think the lesson here is never enter a desert, and I definitely don't think the lesson is if you're tough enough, you'll always survive. That's nonsense. Prosperi was incredibly lucky. The shrine mattered, the animals mattered, the weather mattered, his physical conditioning mattered, his decisions mattered, and eventually, the goats mattered. Move any one of those pieces, and maybe we're telling a different story. That's uncomfortable, but that's survival. You can make every good decision available to you, and nature still gets a vote. What I do think this story shows is how quickly your definition of important can change. At the start of the Marathon des Sables, Prosperi cared about performance, position, time, maybe medals. Hours later, he cared about water, then shade, then finding anything edible, then seeing another person. Everything else disappeared. And when I read stories like this, it makes normal life look almost ridiculous. The things that can ruin our entire day. Traffic, a slow computer, someone not replying to a message, a bad meeting. And somewhere in the Sahara, a man once looked at a handful of goats and realized they were the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Perspective is strange like that. If I try to put myself in Prosperi's position, I think the helicopter would have broken me. That's the moment. Not the hunger, not even the first night. Seeing rescue almost happen and then watching it fly away. I think I'd replay that scene constantly. Did I wave enough? Was the flare too late? Should I have run somewhere else? What if the pilot had looked down 5 seconds earlier? Those questions can destroy you because they don't have answers. Prosperi couldn't afford that. The helicopter was gone. So eventually, he had to focus on the only things still available. What do I do now? And maybe that's one of the most useful things survival stories teach us. Not optimism, not motivational quotes, something much colder. The previous mistake is already dead. What matters is the next decision. For Mauro Prosperi, those decisions became brutally simple. Move when the temperature allows. Rest when it doesn't. Find shade. Look for life. Protect the feet. Save moisture. watch the clouds, keep going. Not survive 9 days, because he didn't know it would be 9 days. Not walk to Algeria. He didn't know he was going there. Just reach the next patch of shade, then the next, then the next, until one day there were goats. That's what I find most incredible about this story. Mauro Prosperi entered the Sahara voluntarily. He was one of the strongest people in the race, an Olympian, a policeman, a lifelong athlete. And within a few days, none of those titles mattered. The desert reduced him to the most basic version of a human being. Water, food, shade, direction, life. But the athlete was still there somewhere. Not the athlete who wanted a medal, the athlete who knew how to continue after his body said stop. And maybe that was the part of him that finally walked out. 9.5 days after disappearing into the Sahara, Mauro Prosperi found people. He had crossed far from the race route and into Algeria. His body was devastated. His race was obviously over. But the only finish line that mattered anymore, he crossed, alive. And decades later, he would still speak about the desert not only as the place where he nearly died, but as the place where he learned how intensely alive a person can feel when everything unnecessary disappears. When I imagine the final image of this story, I don't see Prosperi running. I see him walking, thin, burned by the sun, shoes cut apart, lips cracked, moving slowly across a landscape that seems to go on forever. And then, far away, something moves. At first he doesn't know what it is, maybe another illusion, maybe his eyes are lying again. But he gets closer. Goats. And beyond them, a girl. Another human being. After 9.5 days of the Sahara telling him that he was completely alone, the world finally answered back. And sometimes survival comes down to exactly that. One more hill, one more hour, one more step, before the thing you've been searching for finally appears.